What would you do if your brother murdered your parents? Let that question sit with you. Not accidentally, not in a tragic mishap, but brutally, with intention, with rage, with a weapon, in the dead of night, in a place meant to be safe, a family estate, nestled in the calm of Brentwood's wealthiest corner. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Now imagine being the one to find them. And then, imagine standing in front of cameras, microphones, the world, declaring not grief, not confusion, not forgiveness, but something colder, something final. We disown you. That's what Jake Reiner said. He didn't whisper it. He didn't cry as he said it. He announced it. The words landed like a sledgehammer. Not just for his brother Nick, sitting behind bars awaiting trial for the double homicide of their parents, legendary filmmaker Rob Reiner and his wife Michelle, but for the world watching. How does a family fall this far? How does a legacy built on laughter, on Hollywood dreams, collapse into blood and betrayal? And more importantly, what don't we know yet? Because Jake didn't just speak for himself. His words hinted at something deeper. A long-simmering fracture. A family secret. Maybe even a cover-up. But before we go there, before we dive into the timeline, the witness reports, the shredded letters, the emotional landmines, we need to understand the stage this story was set on. Because this isn't just another true crime tale. This is the implosion of one of America's most iconic families. And every moment we uncover takes us closer to a truth Jake himself may not have been ready to face. Let's rewind. Sunday, December 14th. Brentwood, Los Angeles. A quiet morning. At the $13.5 million Reiner estate, the day started like any other. The security team checked in. A gardener trimmed the hedges. Housekeeper arrived at 9:15 a.m., late, but not alarmingly so. And then, silence. No one answered the intercom. The gate logs stopped recording entries. Phone calls went unanswered. By noon, their daughter Romy Reiner, 27, bright, artistic, and very private, had made multiple attempts to call her parents. By 3:42 p.m., she was at the estate herself. And by 3:47 p.m., she was on the phone with 911. The call, now publicly released, is difficult to hear. Her voice is unsteady, breathing hard. In the background, a dog barking. Possibly two. The operator asks what's happening. Romy's words? My parents, they're not moving. There's blood everywhere. And my brother was here. He was here last night. He has a key. He was angry. By 4:15 p.m., LAPD was on the scene. By 4:28 p.m., the Reiners were declared dead. Cause of death? Multiple sharp force injuries. Manner of death? Homicide. Arrest made at 7:22 p.m. Nick Reiner, 32, was taken into custody without incident from the guest house on the estate property. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He just waited. But here's where it starts to twist. Because the public assumed this was an open and shut case. Troubled son. Celebrity parents. Violence. Arrest. But Jake Reiner's response wasn't what anyone expected. See, Jake is the eldest. A former journalist, a clean-cut television anchor turned filmmaker. A quiet presence. Never tabloid fodder. The one who kept his head down. And then, 3 days later, he stood behind a podium, flanked by microphones, and delivered a statement no sibling should ever have to make. He didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He didn't equivocate. He said, "My name is Jake Reiner. I speak today as a son, as a brother, and as someone who will never see his parents again. I have no words to describe the grief I feel, but I do have words for the man responsible. Nick, this was the final line. You crossed it. We disown you. You are no longer our brother. You are no longer part of this family. We will never speak your name again." It was brutal. It was raw. And it was watched by 23 million people in the first 24 hours. But here's what no one noticed at first. Jake didn't just say Nick was guilty. He said Nick had been crossing lines for years. He said, this was the final line. So what were the other lines? What secrets had been kept? What family history was never shared with the public? And most chilling of all, why did Jake say we disown you with such certainty before Nick had even gone to trial? Did he know something we didn't? Or had something already been set in motion behind the scenes? This is where our journey begins. Over the next chapters, we'll uncover never-before-heard details from the crime scene, Witness testimony that was never aired on the news. Security footage mysteriously deleted and then recovered. A handwritten letter from Nick to Jake, discovered too late. The disturbing mental health spiral no one in the family wanted to acknowledge. The inheritance battle that started months before the murders. And a whispered Hollywood rumor that the family had been hiding something for years. We'll meet the Reiners, not the ones in magazine spreads or red carpet premieres, but the fractured, haunted family trying to hold it all together behind closed doors. We'll follow Jake's journey, from silence to rage, from brother to outcast maker. We'll see Romy's role shift, from little sister to reluctant witness. And we'll ask ourselves the hardest questions. Is blood really thicker than truth? Can forgiveness exist after betrayal that deep? And what kind of family love survives when murder enters the room? So if you're here for the sensational details, stay tuned. But if you're here to understand the human cost, the emotional carnage behind headlines, you're in the right place. Because this story, it's not just about murder. It's about what happens next. And as you'll soon discover, the announcement Jake made wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Because somewhere, locked in a jail cell, Nick Reiner had already sent Jake something. A message, a handwritten letter, full of rage, denial, and one secret that changes everything. But before we open that letter, let's step into the house where it all began. Let's walk through the blood-stained floorboards. Let's hear the 911 call. Let's rewind time. Because the house may be quiet now, but the truth? It's about to scream. What does a crime scene feel like? Not what it looks like, blood, tape, flashing lights. We've seen that 1,000 times on TV. But what does it feel like when you walk into a home filled with memories, and all those memories have been cut in half? That was the question facing detectives as they stepped through the ornate wooden doors of Rob and Michelle Reiner's Brentwood estate on the afternoon of December 14th. Nothing could have prepared them, because what they found inside wasn't just a scene of horror, it was a contradiction. A place that screamed both luxury and loss, comfort and chaos. And right in the middle of it, two bodies. Lifeless, unmoving, still wearing the clothes they had worn the night before. Let's start with the house. The Reiner estate wasn't just big. It was immaculate. Nearly 10,000 square feet. Imported marble. Custom walnut paneling. Rare art lining the walls. Some originals, some sentimental copies from Rob's early career. Security cameras covered nearly every entrance. There were 4 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, and a sprawling kitchen that had hosted A-listers, political fundraisers, and family dinners alike. But on that Sunday afternoon, it was silent. Too silent. The housekeeper, Maria Delgado, arrived around 9:15 a.m. She later told police she thought it was strange that no one greeted her at the door. Michelle usually left a list of instructions. Rob would wave from the upstairs landing or be heard pacing in his study. But that morning, nothing. Maria assumed they were sleeping in, or maybe out for a walk. She started cleaning quietly, but as she made her way upstairs, she felt it. The bedroom door was cracked open just enough, and the smell hit her first. Metallic, thick, lingering. She backed away. Then she heard something else. Footsteps. From downstairs. Not hers. Panicked, she left the house and called Romy. That call lasted only 12 seconds. By the time Romy arrived 20 minutes later, Maria was still outside, shaking. The gate was still open. The dogs were nowhere in sight. And Romy did what only a daughter could do. She walked in, straight through the front foyer, past the framed Emmy Awards and family portraits, past the kitchen where she'd once helped her mom bake cookies on Christmas Eve, up the stairs. She called out, "Mom? Dad?" No answer. She pushed the door fully open and froze. Both of them, side by side, on the bed, Rob on the left, face pale, blood pooling beneath him. Michelle still in her robe, her hands curled inward as if trying to protect herself in those final moments. And this wasn't a single stab. This was rage. This was someone who didn't just want them dead, but wanted them gone. Now, here's where the contradictions begin. Despite the horrific scene, no signs of forced entry. No smashed glass. No broken locks. The alarm system had been disarmed manually at 11:09 p.m. the night before. And only one person besides Rob and Michelle had the code. Nick. The guest house, a separate structure about 50 feet from the main house, had its own security feed. But oddly, the The footage from 9 p.m. to 4 a.m. was wiped. Deleted. Not corrupted. Deliberately erased. But digital forensics recovered fragments. One of them showed Nick walking toward the main house just before midnight, wearing dark clothes. No coat. No shoes. Just walking. Deliberate. Slow. Like he'd done it before. Police later discovered that he still had a copy of the alarm code written in an old notebook. One Jake had begged their parents to deactivate. They never did. Now, pause for a second. How many times have you heard someone say, "We never thought it would happen to us"? The Reiners probably thought that too. Yes, Nick had problems. Yes, there were family fights. Yes, he'd been in and out of rehab. But murder? It didn't fit. Until it did. And suddenly, all the warning signs, brushed off for years, came flooding back. The arguments. The paranoia. The outbursts. Jake once told a friend that Nick lives in his own version of reality. He never imagined that reality would become a crime scene. When the LAPD secured the area, they were met with confusion and pressure, because this wasn't just any home. This was Rob Reiner's home. Director of A Few Good Men, The Princess Bride, Stand By Me. An architect of American culture. And now, just another victim of American violence. The media swarmed. Neighbors watched from behind hedges. Drones hovered overhead. But inside the house, something else happened. Detectives found 2 wine glasses in the kitchen. One half full, the other rinsed out, but still wet. Only one set of fingerprints, Michelle's. So who rinsed the second glass? And why? Meanwhile, the guest house told its own story. The front door was unlocked. Nick was inside, curled on the couch, headphones in, eyes closed. He didn't react when the police entered. Only when they said his name did he look up and mutter, "Took you long enough." That was it. No shock. No confusion. No denial. Just acceptance. One officer later described it as the calmest arrest I've ever made. But calm can be chilling too, can't it? Especially when you find out that under the couch cushion was a knife. A hunting knife. Still wet. And engraved with 2 initials. RR. Rob Reiner. But the most disturbing detail? There was no sign of struggle in the bedroom. Which suggests Rob and Michelle may have known who was standing over them. They may not have screamed. They may have thought they could talk him down. That this was just another episode. Another emotional collapse. But it wasn't. This time, it was final. Let's talk about motive. What would drive a son to kill? Money? Possibly. The Reiners were worth tens of millions. Nick had been cut off financially, at least publicly. But what if it wasn't just about money? What if it was about legacy? Being left behind. Ignored. Forgotten. Jake had taken the family spotlight. Romy, the favorite. Nick, the shadow. And sometimes, shadows fight back. But here's what the press didn't report. There were scratches on Nick's arms, some old, some fresh. Under Rob's fingernails, skin tissue. He fought back. And that changed everything. It wasn't just a sneak attack. It was a confrontation. Which means Rob saw his son, faced him, and died anyway. Romy's statement to the police was heartbreaking. "I told them something like this would happen," she said. "I told them he wasn't safe." She'd begged her parents to install better security, to lock the interior doors, to stop trusting Nick. But they couldn't. They wouldn't. Because no matter what he did, he was still their son. And that's the trap, isn't it? The people we love the most are also the ones who can destroy us completely. Jake arrived at the scene hours later. By then, the bodies had been removed. The house was taped off. He didn't speak to reporters. He didn't even go inside. He stood on the sidewalk, hands in pockets, head down. Then, slowly, he turned and walked away. A few days later, he would deliver the statement that broke the internet. The one where he said, "We disown you." But as we'll soon learn, Jake's silence in those first moments wasn't coldness. It was strategy, because he already knew more than anyone else. Someone had sent him something that morning. A message. A warning. Something only a brother would understand. But what was in that message? And why did Jake wait to reveal it? Because it turns out, the Reiner estate wasn't the only place that bled that day. And what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Have you ever noticed how every family has one person no one knows how to talk about? Not the golden child. Not the favorite. Not the disappointment everyone gossips about openly. But the one who exists in the background. The one whose name makes the room go quiet. Nick Reiner was that person. And long before the blood. Long before the sirens. Long before Jake stood at a podium and said, "We disown you," Nick had already disappeared from the family story. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Nick wasn't always the problem. There was a time when he was the funny one, the imaginative one, the kid who could mimic voices at the dinner table and make Rob laugh so hard he'd have to put his fork down. Family friends remember Nick as intense, yes, but brilliant. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't ignored because he lacked talent. He was ignored because he didn't fit the narrative. Jake was the responsible one. Romy was the sensitive artist. Nick was chaos. And chaos doesn't age well in families that value appearances. Ask yourself this. How many families quietly rewrite history when one child starts to struggle? They stop telling stories about them. They stop putting their photos on the wall. They stop mentioning their name unless absolutely necessary. That's how Nick faded. Nick was born into expectation. Being Rob Reiner's son didn't come with options. It came with pressure. You're expected to be exceptional. You're expected to be interesting. You're expected to be grateful. And Nick tried. He tried acting classes, writing workshops, music. None of it stuck. Not because he couldn't do it, but because he didn't want to be compared. Every audition ended with, "Your father is amazing." Every meeting began with, "So what's Rob like at home?" Nick wasn't building a career. He was living in a shadow. And shadows do strange things to people. The first real crack appeared in his early 20s. A sudden withdrawal. Friends said he stopped returning messages, stopped showing up. He moved back into the family home temporarily. Temporary became permanent. Then came the mood swings. Periods of intense focus followed by long silences. Bursts of anger followed by shame. The family didn't call it mental illness. They called it Nick being Nick. That's an important distinction. Because when you normalize warning signs, you stop seeing them. Jake saw it first. He tried talking to his parents. He suggested therapy, distance, boundaries. But Rob and Michelle couldn't do it. To them, Nick wasn't dangerous. He was fragile. And fragile people don't get pushed away, they get pulled closer. Even when they shouldn't. By his late 20s, Nick had cycled through rehab more than once. Each time, there was hope. Each time, disappointment followed. But what never changed was the family rule. What happens at home stays at home. No police. No formal reports. No public acknowledgement. And that silence? It didn't protect Nick. It protected the family image. Here's where things get uncomfortable. Because buried in Nick's past were incidents that never made headlines. Explosive arguments. Objects thrown. Threats that were brushed off as emotional exaggeration. Romy once told a friend she was afraid to be alone with him when he was angry. Jake stopped visiting when Nick was around. And yet, Nick still lived on the property. Still had access. Still had keys. Still had codes. Why? Because cutting him off felt cruel. And kindness, unchecked, can be deadly. Nick knew he was being managed. That's the word he used later. Managed. Like a problem no one wanted to solve. Just contain. He wasn't trusted, but he wasn't exiled. He existed in limbo. And limbo is where resentment grows. The guest house became his world. A few hundred feet from the main house, but emotionally miles away. From his window, Nick could see the lights on at night. Hear laughter. Music. Dinner parties. He wasn't invited anymore. Not because he was banned, but because no one thought to ask. Imagine watching your family live without you. Night after night. That does something to a person. Nick began keeping journals. Messy. Unstructured. Angry. Later discovered, these writings weren't plans, but they were fantasies. Of recognition. Of confrontation. Of being seen. He wrote about feeling invisible. About being the mistake no one admits. And in one entry, dated months before the deaths, he wrote, "They don't listen until it's loud." No one saw that line in time. Here's the contradiction that haunts Jake to this day. Nick loved his parents. Deeply. That's what makes this story unbearable. He didn't hate them in the way strangers imagine. He hated what they represented. Control. Judgment. Conditional love. They were both his anchor and his prison. The night before everything ended, Nick reportedly sent Jake a message. Just 3 words. "You should have listened." Jake didn't see it until the next morning. At the time, he assumed it was another emotional outburst. He ignored it. That decision will haunt him forever. So when Jake later stood at that podium and said, "We disown you," it wasn't just anger. It was guilt. It was realization. It was the understanding that the family had failed Nick, and Nick had responded in the worst possible way. But here's the question no one wants to ask. Did Nick snap that night? Or was that night simply the moment everything finally broke through? Because when investigators dug deeper into Nick's past, they found something that changed the entire narrative. Something hidden, something sealed, something even Jake didn't know. And once that secret surfaced, the line between monster and victim became dangerously blurred. But that revelation didn't come from police. It came from Romy. And what she told detectives next would tear the family apart all over again. If your family was destroyed overnight, could you find the strength to speak? Could you walk into a police station, grieving, trembling, stunned, and point the finger at your own blood? Most couldn't. But Romy Reiner did. And what she told detectives, it didn't just confirm suspicions. It detonated them. Let's rewind. It's December 14th, 3:42 p.m. Romy arrives at her childhood home. The gate is still ajar. The security pad, unlocked. The estate, eerily silent. She finds the housekeeper outside, shaking, pale, speechless. No one has gone inside. But Romy doesn't hesitate. She moves through the front hallway, past the family piano, past the oil portrait of her father from his all in the family days, up the stairs, and into the room. What she sees, she won't describe in full to the media. But later, in sworn testimony, she would say, "It didn't feel real. My first thought was, this has to be a movie set, a nightmare. Then I saw the blood. So much blood. And I knew." She called 911, but she didn't wait for them to ask questions. Her first words to the operator? "My brother was here last night. My brother has a key. He's unstable. He should be a suspect." It wasn't a moment of hesitation. It wasn't cautious. It was decisive, and it cracked the entire case wide open. Because before police had even examined the bodies, Romy had pointed them in the direction of Nick. Why? What did she know? And what had she seen leading up to that fatal night? The answer wasn't in one big moment. It was in 1,000 small ones. The family dinners where Nick would show up hours late, then accuse everyone of judging him. The Christmas mornings where his gifts remained unopened because he refused to come downstairs. The text messages, furious, misspelled, and sent in bursts. The voicemail he left Romy just 2 weeks prior. "You think I'm a freak? You think I'm sick? You're not better than me." Romy hadn't shared that with anyone, not even Jake, because she didn't want to make it worse. She wanted to believe Nick could get better, that the brother she remembered, the one who used to braid her hair, draw cartoons for her, defend her in school, still existed under the anger. But as she told police, "I was wrong. I waited too long. I should have said something sooner." At the precinct, Romy sat in a small room for nearly 4 hours. No lawyer, no media, just grief and memory. She recounted the last week in painstaking detail. Nick had been agitated, paranoid. He believed their parents were colluding against him. He told her, during a walk around the estate, that he felt watched. Not just by cameras, by them. He said, "Dad's changing the will. I saw the paperwork." And Romy didn't believe him, until detectives later confirmed that a will had been updated just a month earlier. And in that update, Nick's name had been removed. Completely. No inheritance. No trust fund access. Nothing. Did he know for sure? Romy asked later. No. But he guessed. And once he believed it, it was over. That line stuck with the lead investigator. Because belief, when combined with instability, can be deadly. It doesn't take facts. It just takes fear. And fear spreads fast in a mind already drowning. But Romy didn't stop there. She told police something no one else had. Nick had made threats before. Not just vague ones. Specific. She recalled a conversation from 6 months earlier. They were in the kitchen. Rob had just left for a charity gala. Nick was drinking, though he said he was clean. His hands were shaking. He looked at her and said, "One day, they'll wish they had treated me better. But it'll be too late." Romy laughed it off. Nervous laughter. She said, "You don't mean that." He didn't respond. Just stared. She never told anyone. Until now. In that same interview, Romy revealed another key moment. 3 nights before the murders, she visited the main house to drop off documents. She passed Nick outside. He was pacing in the garden, muttering. She caught only fragments. "They don't listen. Erase me. They think I won't." She didn't engage. She walked faster, got in her car, left. It wasn't the first time he'd spiraled. but it would be the last time she saw him before the world fell apart. Detectives asked her one final question before ending the session. If Nick is watching this later, what would you say to him? She didn't hesitate. I loved you. I fought for you. But you crossed a line that can't be undone. And I hope, wherever you are, you finally see what you've done. To them. To me. To yourself. She paused, then added, and don't you dare blame anyone else. That testimony did more than help investigators. It shifted public perception. Because until then, some had speculated maybe Nick was being framed. Maybe the Reiners were the kind of Hollywood parents who crushed their kids under pressure. Maybe this was another case of the forgotten son being scapegoated. But Romy's words were devastatingly clear. This wasn't theater. This was a daughter who watched her family decay and finally broke the silence. And what came out of that silence would lead straight to Jake. Because what Romy said next, off the record, changed everything. She told Jake about a night years ago. One none of them had ever spoken about. A night where Nick had locked himself in a bathroom, screaming, crying, writing something on the walls. And when the family finally got the door open, there was blood. Not much, but enough. Nick had carved one sentence into his own forearm. They'll only love me when I'm gone. Romy never forgot it. Jake tried to forget it. But now it was back. And for the first time, Jake started to wonder, had they missed something bigger? Was this just violence? Or was this the message? Because Nick had left something else behind. A letter. And what it said was worse than anyone expected. They looked perfect from the outside, didn't they? The Reiner family. Hollywood royalty. Progressive. Charismatic. Warm. They hosted legendary dinner parties. Marched at protests. Won awards. Gave back. But what do you really know about a family? What do you see when the curtains are closed, the cameras stop rolling, and the fame stops insulating the fractures? Because behind every spotlight is a shadow. And in the Reiner household, that shadow had a name. Nick. Family dynamics are a strange thing. They don't follow logic. They follow legacy, emotion, unspoken rules. And in the Reiner home, those rules were loud, despite no one ever saying them out loud. Rule number 1, Jake is the golden boy. Rule number 2, Romy is the heart. Rule number 3, Nick is the liability. The unspoken black sheep. The ticking time bomb. The one everyone hoped would eventually figure it out, while quietly rearranging their schedules to avoid him. And yet, he was never truly cast out. Because here's the contradiction. The Reiners loved Nick. They hoped for Nick. They feared Nick. All at once. Let's break it down. Jake, the eldest. Stoic. Dependable. Polished. He followed the rules. Graduated on time. Built a journalism career. Stayed out of the tabloids. When Rob looked at Jake, he saw a mirror. Not of his looks, but of his control. His restraint. Jake was safe. But safety in a family like this comes at a cost. He became the enforcer. The one who said, Nick can't come to Thanksgiving this year. The one who told friends, we're managing things privately. He didn't raise his voice. He raised his boundaries. And Nick hated him for it. Romy, the youngest. Sensitive. Artistic. Quiet. She was the bridge between her parents and Nick. She wrote him letters in rehab. Painted with him in the garden during his better months. Defended him in private even when he lashed out in public. But even bridges crack. When Nick's mood swings got worse, Romy pulled back. Not out of malice, but for self-preservation. And Nick never forgave her for that. Because to him, Romy wasn't just a sister. She was his last hope. Rob and Michelle, Hollywood legends. Beloved. Grounded. But parenting? That's a different story. They weren't cold. They weren't abusive. But they were terrified of losing control. They raised Jake and Romy with structure. Deadlines. Chores. Expectations. Nick? He resisted it all. Every rule felt like a trap. Every suggestion, a criticism. Every consequence, a betrayal. So the parents adapted. They tiptoed. They made excuses. He's going through something. He just needs more time. We'll try another therapist. But trying became their permanent state. And eventually, the trying stopped. Not officially. Emotionally. There's one night the family doesn't talk about. But staff remember. A Thanksgiving, 2019. Nick had been clean for 7 months. He was invited to dinner. It started well. He brought wine. Made jokes. Sat at the table. Then Jake brought up politics. A harmless debate. One they'd had 100 times. But something snapped. Nick stood up. Slammed his glass. shouted at his father. You love your fans more than your own son. Silence. Romy tried to calm him down. Nick turned to her and said, Don't pretend you care. You're just waiting for me to relapse so you can feel superior. He stormed out. That night, Rob changed the alarm codes. But he never told Nick. Now pause. Can you imagine being a parent, watching your son spiral, your daughter cry, your eldest clench his jaw in silence, and still not knowing what to do? They weren't cruel. They were conflicted. And conflict, when unaddressed, becomes poison. Michelle tried to be the peacemaker. She sent Nick groceries, paid for his medications, left the porch light on, even when no one was coming. But she also kept her distance. One staff member recalls Michelle once saying, I'm afraid he'll hate me forever, but I'm more afraid of what he'll do if we push him out. Those words now echo like prophecy. Rob? He struggled the most. He wanted to understand Nick, but he didn't speak Nick's language. Rob was logic, strategy, control. Nick was chaos, emotion, wounds. They talked past each other for years. And eventually, they stopped talking at all. One of Rob's final emails to Jake reportedly read, I've accepted that Nick isn't the son I hoped he'd be. But maybe that's our fault too. Tragic words. Because by the time they were written, the damage had already begun. Let's talk about the guest house. It was supposed to be temporary. A few months. Maybe a year. It became Nick's cave. Romy called it the bunker. Dark curtains. Flickering lights. Books stacked in towers. Whiteboards covered in scribbles. Some creative, some disturbing. There were journals. Drawings. Letters, never sent. And a wall. A literal wall. With photos of family members, quotes taped beside them. Some loving. Some accusatory. Jake's photo had a quote underneath. Perfect doesn't mean safe. Rob said, You talk, but you don't listen. Romy's? I remember when you used to care. What was Nick building in there? A manifesto? A memory palace? Or just a place to feel noticed? No one knows for sure. But Jake found it after the arrest. And what he saw chilled him. Not because it was violent, but because it was lonely. Years of isolation. Years of rage turned inward. And slowly, outward. Here's the part that doesn't make headlines. Families don't fall apart from one argument. They erode over time. With silences. With unspoken resentments. With missed opportunities to say, I see you. The Reiner family had all the tools. Wealth, education, access. But no one taught them how to handle each other. No one taught them how to survive Nick. So they coped the way many families do. They labeled. They distanced. They hoped time would fix it. But time doesn't fix emotional landmines. It just covers them. Until someone steps on one. And that brings us back to Jake. The moment he said, We disown you. That wasn't just a rejection. It was a declaration. That the old dynamic was dead. That pretending Nick could be saved by silence was over. That love had limits. But there's one thing Jake didn't know when he said those words. That somewhere in that guest house bunker was a recording, a conversation between Rob and Nick. Their final one, captured on a phone Nick had left recording on his bookshelf. A file labeled Dad. Police didn't find it immediately. But when they did, everything changed. Because what Rob said in that final conversation wasn't anger. It was fear. And what Nick said back shook investigators to the core. But what came next would flip the narrative again. Have you ever heard a sentence so final it felt like a door slamming shut inside your chest? Not shouted, not whispered, just delivered. Clean, controlled, irrevocable. That's how Jake Reiner said it. We disown you. No tears, no trembling voice, no dramatic pause. Just 4 words that landed like a verdict. But before we get to the podium, the cameras, the headlines, before the moment that froze the nation, we need to understand what happened before Jake stepped into the light. Because that statement wasn't spontaneous. It was calculated. It was deliberate. And it was fueled by something Jake had been carrying since the morning his parents died. Something the public didn't know. Something he hadn't told Romy. Something Nick had sent him. The morning after the arrests, Jake didn't go to the house. He didn't call reporters. He didn't speak to friends. He sat alone in his apartment, blinds drawn, phone face down on the table. He replayed one message over and over. 3 words. You should have listened. At first, he thought it was just another accusation. Another emotional jab. Nick had sent dozens like it over the years. But this one felt different. Because this time, Jake had listened. He'd listened to Romy's fears. to his own instincts, to years of warning signs. And he'd done nothing that stopped what came next. That realization gnawed at him. Jake's grief wasn't loud. It was sharp, contained. He didn't collapse. He didn't scream. He compartmentalized. That's how he survived. But grief has a way of leaking through cracks. And Jake's crack came when he opened an email from the family attorney. Attached, preliminary findings from investigators. Timeline. Security logs. Recovered footage. And a note at the bottom. There may be additional materials recovered from the guest house. We will update. Jake closed his laptop, stood up, and said out loud, to no one. It's him. Not as a question, as a fact. The decision to speak publicly came fast. Too fast, some said. Friends urged caution. Legal counsel warned him. Anything you say can be used. PR consultants suggested softer language. Compassion. Distance. Jake rejected all of it. Because compassion, in his mind, had already cost too much. This wasn't about optics. It was about drawing a line so clear that it could never be blurred again. The press conference was scheduled 3 days after the murders. Jake arrived alone. No Romy. No attorney beside him. No prepared statement in hand. Just a folded sheet of paper in his jacket pocket. The cameras rolled. Microphones clicked on. And the room went silent. Jake looked up, scanned the crowd, then began. My name is Jake Reiner. I am the eldest son of Rob and Michelle Reiner. His voice didn't waver. He acknowledged the loss. Spoke of his parents with reverence. Thanked first responders. And then, without warning, he shifted. This is not a time for speculation, he said. This is a time for truth. That word, truth, hung in the air. And then he delivered it. I will not pretend that what happened came out of nowhere. There were signs. There were warnings. And there were choices made. A murmur rippled through the room. Jake paused, then said the words no one expected. My brother Nick crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. As a family, we have made the decision to disown him. He is no longer welcome in our lives, our legacy, or our future. Gasps. Flashes. Silence. And then the line that changed everything. This is not revenge. This is accountability. Why did that sentence hit so hard? Because families don't usually do this. They deny. They deflect. They protect. Jake did the opposite. He severed. And in doing so, he shattered the illusion that blood always comes first. Public reaction was immediate and viciously divided. Some praised his strength. They called him brave, decisive, honest. Others condemned him. Cold, heartless, opportunistic. How can you disown your own brother before trial? Critics asked. Jake didn't respond. But inside, he was wrestling with something far more complicated. Because as he spoke those words, he wasn't just disowning Nick. He was disowning the version of himself that had stayed silent for too long. Behind the scenes, the statement triggered chaos. Lawyers scrambled. Family friends called nonstop. Romy was blindsided. She watched the press conference from her phone, alone in her apartment, and broke down, not because she disagreed with Jake, but because she wasn't ready. She later said, it felt like losing another brother. That comment would resurface later, painfully. Jake returned home after the press conference and found something waiting for him. An envelope. No return address. Inside, a handwritten letter. The handwriting was unmistakable. Nick's. The letter was dated the night before the murders. Jake's hands shook as he read it. Not because of fear. Because of recognition. Nick wrote about betrayal. About being erased. About watching the family move on without him. He accused Jake of playing judge. Of deciding who was worthy of the Reiner name. And then came the line that made Jake sit down. You think this is about hate. It's not. It's about finally being heard. Jake folded the letter slowly. This wasn't a confession. It wasn't an apology. It was something else. A justification. And that terrified him more than rage ever could. Jake realized something in that moment. Nick didn't see himself as a villain. He saw himself as a consequence. A product of years of silence, dismissal, and quiet shame. That didn't excuse what he'd done, but it explained the mindset. An explanation complicated everything. The statement also had legal consequences. Nick's defense team seized on it immediately. They framed Jake as biased, emotional, motivated by inheritance. Suddenly, the public statement wasn't just moral. It was strategic ammunition. Jake knew this risk. He accepted it, because in his mind, silence had already failed. But here's the part the public never heard. Before the press conference, Jake visited the jail. One visit. No cameras. No press. Just two brothers sitting across a table. Nick looked different. Smaller. Thinner. But his eyes were sharp. Focused. Nick smiled when he saw Jake. "That was fast," he said. "Didn't think you'd turn on me so publicly." Jake didn't sit right away. He stood and said, "I'm not turning on you. I'm stepping away." Nick laughed. A short, hollow sound. "You always were good at that." Jake said nothing. He slid the letter back across the table. "I got this," he said. Nick's smile faded. "Good," Nick replied. "Then you know I didn't do it for nothing." That sentence haunted Jake. Because what did that mean? For nothing? What exactly did Nick think he'd accomplished? Jake left without another word. And hours later, he went public. Because in his mind, there was no going back. Not after that visit. Not after that sentence. But as the days passed, cracks began to form. New evidence surfaced. Security footage was reanalyzed. Audio files recovered. And one thing became clear. Nick had not acted impulsively. He had planned. And planning implies purpose. Which brings us to the next chapter. Because while the world focused on Jake's words, investigators were uncovering something else entirely. Something that suggested the murders were not the beginning, but the end of a long, carefully constructed descent. And when that truth surfaced, Jake would be forced to confront a question he never wanted to ask. Had disowning Nick come too late? Or had it been exactly what Nick wanted all along? Because what the surveillance footage revealed next would change the case forever. What if the most dangerous thing Nick Reiner ever left behind wasn't the knife? What if it was his words? Because long after the crime scene was scrubbed clean, long after the cameras moved on, and long after Jake's statement echoed across the world, one object continued to pulse with quiet menace. A letter. Handwritten. Unsent. And never meant for the police. It wasn't found on Nick when he was arrested. It wasn't logged in with evidence. It was hidden, tucked inside a hollowed-out hardcover book in the guest house. A book Nick had carried with him for years. A book no one else ever touched. And when investigators finally found it, days later, it raised a chilling question. If Nick had already written this, then what exactly was he planning to happen next? Let's go back. The guest house had been searched twice already. Once during the arrest. Once during the initial evidence sweep. Both times, officers focused on the obvious. The couch. The bathroom. The kitchen counter. The knife. But the third search was different. This time, it was digital forensics and behavioral analysts leading the charge. People trained not just to look for weapons, but for meaning. They noticed something odd. A bookshelf that had been moved recently. Dust patterns disturbed. One book slightly heavier than the others. Inside it, folded carefully, was the letter, addressed to one person. Jake. Jake didn't want to read it. That's the truth. When the family attorney called and said, "There's something you should see," Jake already knew. He had felt it coming, like pressure behind the eyes, like the moment before a storm breaks. He drove to the office alone. No Romy, no advisors, no witnesses. And when the envelope slid across the table toward him, his hands froze. Because this letter wasn't angry. It wasn't frantic. It was calm. Too calm. Nick's handwriting was neat, almost careful, as if he wanted every word to be understood. The first line didn't accuse. It didn't threaten. It asked a question. "Do you remember when we were kids and you promised you'd never leave me behind?" Jake stopped reading. Because he did remember. A playground. A scraped knee. A brother crying while everyone else ran ahead. Jake had meant it then. But promises made in childhood don't always survive adulthood. Nick continued. "You became who they needed you to be. I became who they were afraid I already was." There was no apology. But there was something else. A justification woven through every sentence. Nick wrote about being watched. About living in the guest house like a ghost. About hearing laughter from the main house and knowing it wasn't meant for him. You call it distance. I call it exile. That line circled in Jake's mind for days. Then came the part that made the attorney stop reading altogether. Nick wrote, "I didn't wake up that night planning to destroy them. I woke up knowing I couldn't live like this anymore." Read that again. Not, "I didn't plan it," but "I couldn't live like this anymore." That distinction matters. Because it suggests something deeper than rage. It suggests inevitability. Nick described the night in fragments. Walking. The alarm. The door. He wrote about standing in the hallway, and listening to his parents breathe as they slept. He didn't describe violence. He described hesitation. "I waited for someone to stop me," he wrote. No one did. That line sent a chill through the room. Because who was supposed to stop him? God? His conscience? Or the family he believed had already abandoned him? Nick ended the letter with a sentence that left Jake physically ill. "Now they'll finally hear me. Hear me. Not forgive me. Not understand me. Hear me." This wasn't a confession. It was a declaration of impact. Jake sat there for nearly an hour after reading the letter. He didn't cry. He didn't yell. He just stared at the wall, because something in the letter terrified him more than guilt ever could. Nick believed this was necessary. Nick believed this was communication. And that meant he hadn't acted in chaos. He had acted in meaning. But the letter wasn't the only one. That's what investigators discovered next. Because buried in Nick's phone, encrypted, hidden, but recoverable, were drafts. Dozens of them. Letters to Romy. Letters to Rob. Letters to Michelle. Unsent. Each one slightly different. Each one circling the same themes. Neglect. Erasure. Being unseen. And in one draft. To his father, Nick wrote, "I don't want your approval anymore. I want your attention." That line haunted detectives. Because attention, when denied long enough, can turn toxic. Jake learned about the drafts days later. And when he did, something shifted. For the first time since the murders, he questioned himself. Had the family mistaken silence for stability? Had they confused containment for care? Had they believed that as long as Nick wasn't screaming, he was okay? Those questions didn't excuse what Nick had done, but they complicated the narrative Jake had built to survive. The defense seized on the letter immediately. They framed it as evidence of mental deterioration, of a break from reality, of someone who didn't fully grasp consequences. The prosecution saw it differently. They saw intent, deliberation, a man who knew exactly what he was doing and wanted it to resonate. And suddenly, the case shifted. This wasn't just about what happened in the bedroom. It was about what happened over years. Romy read the letter last. She insisted. When she finished, she folded it carefully and said only one thing. "He didn't write this to you." Jake looked up. "What do you mean?" "He wrote it to be remembered." That insight reframed everything. Because memory was Nick's greatest fear. Not prison. Not punishment. Being forgotten. And then came the twist no one expected. A second envelope was found. Not addressed to Jake. Addressed to no one. Just one word on the front. "After." Inside was a single sentence. "If they never listen, make them look. Make them look." Investigators stared at it in silence. Because that wasn't grief. That wasn't remorse. That was performance. The question became unavoidable. Had Nick wanted the trial? Had he wanted the cameras? Had he orchestrated everything, not just to hurt, but to be seen? And if so, what else had he set in motion? Because letters are rarely the end of a story. They're usually the beginning. And as digital analysts continued digging through Nick's devices, they uncovered something far more disturbing than words. A timeline. Dates. Times. Notes. And one entry, highlighted, that stopped everyone cold. Backup. What did Nick mean by backup? A plan B? A person? Or something else entirely? Because if the letter was a message, then the next discovery suggested Nick was never alone. And what came next would force Jake to confront a possibility he never considered. That disowning his brother might not end the story. It might activate it. Security cameras don't lie. That's what we're told. They capture the truth. The raw, unfiltered, time-stamped truth. But what happens when even the footage feels manipulated? What happens when the angles are just slightly off? The audio is incomplete. And a key piece of time that should exist, is simply gone? The Brentwood estate had state-of-the-art security. At least, that's what the Reiner family believed. Multiple cameras, thermal sensors, cloud backups, motion detection, 24/7 recording. It was a fortress. But the night of the murders, something got through. And when investigators finally reviewed the recovered footage, they didn't find peace. They found a puzzle. And in the center of that puzzle was a shadow, moving, pausing, watching, and then vanishing. Let's break down the timeline. December 13th, 11:07 p.m., Michelle Reiner disarms the alarm system from inside the master bedroom. Likely routine. No sign of distress. 11:09 p.m. A figure passes through the main hallway. Not clearly visible. Just a blur. Possibly male. Possibly barefoot. 11:12 p.m., camera feed from the west stairwell glitches. Just for a second, then resumes. No figure appears after that. 11:24 p.m., living room camera picks up faint audio. Two voices, one low and calm, one tense, rising. Investigators believe it was Rob and Nick. They enhanced the audio. Only a few words could be made out. Rob, can't keep doing this. Nick, they all lie. Rob, go back to the guest house. Nick, don't tell me where to go. Then, silence. Not because they stopped talking, but because the feed cuts out entirely at 11:26 p.m. It stays dark for 7 minutes. And that, detectives say, is impossible. The system was built with backups, redundancies. Even if the power went out, a secondary generator would kick in. But here's what's strange. No signs of a forced outage. No tampering with the wiring. No breach detected. The footage simply vanishes. As if someone had anticipated it. As if someone knew how to disappear. When the feed resumes at 11:33 p.m., all is quiet. Too quiet. Rob and Michelle's bedroom door is now closed. The hallway is empty, and the living room lights have been dimmed. Who did that? And why? Moments later, a second figure appears on the outer porch camera. This part sent shivers through the team reviewing the tape. Because the second figure, taller, thinner, wearing dark clothing, doesn't enter the house. They approach the guest house instead. They knock, pause, then walk away. No face captured. No identifying features. And here's the part that broke the case wide open. Nick was already inside the main house when that knock occurred, meaning this second person was someone else. Investigators re-reviewed the footage from the guest house exterior. This time, they enhanced the shadows, tracking movement patterns. And at 11:39 p.m., the second figure returns. This time, they linger. They light a cigarette. They lean against the railing. And then, they throw something toward the bushes. A flicker of red light. Something burning. Then they vanish. The next morning, detectives recovered the item from the garden bed. A half-burnt matchbook, with one word on it. Backup. The same word found in Nick's journal. Let's pause here. This isn't just creepy. It's coordinated. Because now we're not just looking at a violent outburst. We're looking at a timeline with holes. Holes that someone went to great lengths to create. And this second figure? They didn't break in. They weren't caught by alarms. They moved like someone familiar with the grounds. Like someone who belonged. But who? Jake? No. He was confirmed at home with multiple eyewitnesses. Romy? No. At a gallery event, verified by staff and security. Nick? Already inside. So who had access to the property? That's what led investigators down a new path. Because a security audit, completed weeks before, listed only 6 people with gate access codes. 4 were family. 1 was the housekeeper. And the 6th? A name no one had mentioned yet. Brandon Kerr, the Reiner's former private assistant. Fired 6 months prior. For boundary issues, according to HR emails. He hadn't been seen since. Until now. Brandon's name sent the investigation into overdrive. Because Brandon had lived on the estate for almost 3 years. He knew the codes. He knew the blind spots. He knew everything. And he was close with Nick. Too close, Romy would later say. I always felt like Brandon fueled Nick's paranoia, she told detectives. He told him things. Gave him reasons to stay angry. Emails recovered from Nick's laptop confirmed it. Late-night rants. Dozens of pages. Brandon egging him on. They don't respect you. They think you're weak. You should make them see you. Those messages weren't just enabling. They were igniting. And now, with the surveillance footage. Brandon was a ghost who might have been there. Watching. Waiting. Maybe even helping. Jake was the last to hear about the footage. He sat in a private room with the lead detective. They watched together. Frame by frame. When the second figure appeared, Jake didn't move. Didn't blink. But when he saw the matchbook being tossed, he whispered, "Oh my God," because Jake had seen that word before. Not just in Nick's writing, but in a text Nick sent him months earlier. Just so you know, I've got backup. At the time, Jake assumed it meant emotional support. Now, he wasn't so sure. This revelation shook the foundation of Jake's public statement. Because now, the story wasn't just one broken man collapsing under pressure. It was 2 people, maybe more. A conspiracy? A manipulation? A plan? And if that was true, then Nick wasn't just spiraling. He was recruiting. Investigators launched a search for Brandon, but he was already gone. Apartment cleared. Phone disconnected. Bank account drained. Vanish. And suddenly, the narrative spiraled again. Because now, the Reiner family wasn't just a victim of internal collapse. They might have been targeted, from the inside and outside. And as Jake watched the media struggle to make sense of it all, he found himself asking a terrifying question. What if Nick didn't want to be disowned? What if he wanted to be martyred? Because in Nick's mind, being seen, being remembered, mattered more than being right. And if Brandon helped him get that, then Jake's public statement wasn't the final word. It was the first move in a new game. There was one final piece of footage, never released to the public. From 3:47 a.m., hours after the murders, a shadow moves through the garden, carrying something, then kneels and buries it. Police would later dig up the spot. Inside a rusted tin box, another letter. From Nick. Unsealed. Untitled. Just 5 words on the page. They never saw me coming. But the question now was, who else had? Have you ever noticed how every family has one person no one knows how to talk about? Not the golden child. Not the favorite. Not the disappointment everyone gossips about openly. But the one who exists in the background. The one whose name makes the room go quiet. Nick Reiner was that person. And long before the blood, long before the sirens, long before Jake stood at a podium and said, "We disown you," Nick had already disappeared from the family story. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Nick wasn't always the problem. There was a time when he was the funny one, the imaginative one, the kid who could mimic voices at the dinner table and make Rob laugh so hard he'd have to put his fork down. Family friends remember Nick as intense, yes, but brilliant. He wasn't stupid. He wasn't lazy. He wasn't ignored because he lacked talent. He was ignored because he didn't fit the narrative. Jake was the responsible one. Romy was the sensitive artist. Nick was chaos. And chaos doesn't age well in families that value appearances. Ask yourself this. How many families quietly rewrite history when one child starts to struggle? They stop telling stories about them. They stop putting their photos on the wall. They stop mentioning their name unless absolutely necessary. That's how Nick faded. Nick was born into expectation. Being Rob Reiner's son didn't come with options. It came with pressure. You're expected to be exceptional. You're expected to be interesting. You're expected to be grateful. And Nick tried. He tried acting classes, writing workshops, music. None of it stuck. Not because he couldn't do it, but because he didn't want to be compared. Every audition ended with, "Your father is amazing." Every meeting began with, "So what's Rob like at home?" Nick wasn't building a career. He was living in a shadow. And shadows do strange things to people. The first real crack appeared in his early 20s. A sudden withdrawal. Friends said he stopped returning messages, stopped showing up. He moved back into the family home temporarily. Temporary became permanent. Then came the mood swings. Periods of intense focus followed by long silences. Bursts of anger followed by shame. The family didn't call it mental illness. They called it Nick being Nick. That's an important distinction. Because when you normalize warning signs, you stop seeing them. Jake saw it first. He tried talking to his parents. He suggested therapy, distance, boundaries. But Rob and Michelle couldn't do it. To them, Nick wasn't dangerous. He was fragile. And fragile people don't get pushed away, they get pulled closer. Even when they shouldn't. By his late 20s, Nick had cycled through rehab more than once. Each time, there was hope. Each time, disappointment followed. But what never changed was the family rule. What happens at home stays at home. No police. No formal reports. No public acknowledgement. And that silence? It didn't protect Nick. It protected the family image. Here's where things get uncomfortable. Because buried in Nick's past were incidents that never made headlines. Explosive arguments. Objects thrown. Threats that were brushed off as emotional exaggeration. Romy once told a friend she was afraid to be alone with him when he was angry. Jake stopped visiting when Nick was around. And yet, Nick still lived on the property. Still had access. Still had keys. Still had codes. Why? Because cutting him off felt cruel. And kindness, unchecked, can be deadly. Nick knew he was being managed. That's the word he used later. Managed. Like a problem no one wanted to solve. Just contain. He wasn't trusted, but he wasn't exiled. He existed in limbo. And limbo is where resentment grows. The guest house became his world. a few hundred feet from the main house, but emotionally miles away. From his window, Nick could see the lights on at night, hear laughter, music, dinner parties. He wasn't invited anymore. Not because he was banned, but because no one thought to ask. Imagine watching your family live without you, night after night. That does something to a person. Nick began keeping journals. Messy, unstructured, angry. Later discovered, these writings weren't plans, but they were fantasies. Of recognition, of confrontation, of being seen. He wrote about feeling invisible, about being the mistake no one admits. And in one entry, dated months before the deaths, he wrote, "They don't listen until it's loud." No one saw that line in time. Here's the contradiction that haunts Jake to this day. Nick loved his parents deeply. That's what makes this story unbearable. He didn't hate them in the way strangers imagine. He hated what they represented. Control, judgment, conditional love. They were both his anchor and his prison. The night before everything ended, Nick reportedly sent Jake a message. Just 3 words. "You should have listened." Jake didn't see it until the next morning. At the time, he assumed it was another emotional outburst. He ignored it. That decision will haunt him forever. So when Jake later stood at that podium and said, "We disown you," it wasn't just anger. It was guilt. It was realization. It was the understanding that the family had failed Nick, and Nick had responded in the worst possible way. But here's the question no one wants to ask. Did Nick snap that night? Or was that night simply the moment everything finally broke through? Because when investigators dug deeper into Nick's past, they found something that changed the entire narrative. Something hidden, something sealed, something even Jake didn't know. And once that secret surfaced, the line between monster and victim became dangerously blurred. But that revelation didn't come from police. It came from Romy. And what she told detectives next would tear the family apart all over again. If your family was destroyed overnight, could you find the strength to speak? Could you walk into a police station, grieving, trembling, stunned, and point the finger at your own blood? Most couldn't, but Romy Reiner did. And what she told detectives, it didn't just confirm suspicions, it detonated them. Let's rewind. It's December 14th, 3:42 p.m. Romy arrives at her childhood home. The gate is still ajar. The security pad, unlocked. The estate, eerily silent. She finds the housekeeper outside, shaking, pale, speechless.